And in this lesson, we are going to look at tools for Azure DevOps, and where DevOps stands for development and operations. So what has happened over a period of time is that in typical software lifecycle, you plan the development part, and then your developers code it using whatever development tool they use, and they store that code into a code repository, which could be Git, Jira, or Confluence. Then your build team will build that tool or build that particular piece of code in and create a artifact that can be generated into a deployable unit. Then your testing team using Selenium or JUnit or different tools will test it, and then a release team will deploy or release that code into an environment. That tool could be manual, that could be Jenkins, CodeShip, and so on. Now you deploy these things on a as we saw in one of the previous lessons on compute, which could be virtual machine, Docker, or here AWS is just a reference, but in Azure Cloud and so on. Then you operate or manage that using something called Ansible or Kubernetes or Chef or any of these configuration management tool. And then finally you monitor them using Nagios or Splunk or Datadog and so tool. So this is where your two teams, which is development and operations, working together as a single unit. And this is a typical software lifecycle with a very open source kind of a tools that are available here. Now something similar on Azure has a Azure DevOps tools, where you use Azure board to plan your development cycle, to discuss who's doing what work, what are the business requirements, etc. that you've done via Azure board. Then you have Azure repositories or repos, and that repos is basically to store your code. Once the code is stored, you have Azure pipeline, which is to automate your CI/CD build. So where as soon as someone store the code or your developers submit the code into the code repository, a build can kick in, and that build can then generate the deployable artifact and then deploy it on the server. So that's Azure pipeline. You have a test plan, your testers can use those test plan. And then Azure artifact is when the code which is there is being built, that will generate some artifact. So it will create the packages so that they can be deployed using Azure pipeline. So that is a whole CI/CD tool mechanism we call. So what will happen typically in DevOps cycle? Your engineers will be developing the code using any IDE, integrated development environment of their choice. Might be Visual Studio, might be Java tool, or any tool of their choice, and they will store the code into code repository, which is Azure repo. From there, your testers will it will be deployed on a server, and then your testers will be testing it. Once they tested it with the test plan, it's being before your testers can test it, your testing team, or before it can be deployed or tester team test it, your test team will be writing the test plans, and then through the test plan on a unit testing being done. Once that's done, they might go through the Azure pipeline, which is automating this from Azure from here all to the way they are deployed on your whatever compute you are deploying on. It could be virtual machine, it could be containers, it could be web apps, and so on. From there, the output or insights will go, how this application behaving will go onto the insight, and your engineers will pick up any changes, issues, or something from application insight. Your engineers will also be checking Azure board for any new features, functionality, bug fixes, or other things they need to do. So that's a whole end-to-end DevOps cycle on Azure Cloud. Now there is a separate portal that you use in DevOps, and again, if you're part of AZ 400, we are going to go deep into these topics. So you have dev.azure.port.com. From there you have Azure boards, repos, pipeline, test plan, artifacts. You configure them, and then there's the other part. This is more for development and CI/CD team, and there's an operations team which will have the other tools which we cover later, which is like automating ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager, and so on. So this is the dev tools, and this is the whole CI/CD, which were called continuous integration, continuous delivery, which is mainly for CI/CD. So you have developers developing code and building it. That's agile development. Every maybe short sprints, they are developing every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks sprint, developing a functionality, which is agile development. Then these are integrated and tested in an integration environment, which is called as continuous integration. Then it's being released on a dev test environment, and that is continuous delivery. And then it's once it's tested, everything happens, then it's being deployed on a production environment. That's a continuous deployment. Once this testing phase is over, it continuously deployed on production environment. And then it's your ops team managing this. That's a whole end-to-end DevOps process. That's CI/CD, continuous integration. And this is a complete CI/CD Azure DevOps tool. And I explain you, but this is where, assuming you have a dev environment, QA environment, and a production environment, and left hand side is where you Azure board for requirement gathering. Developers have done here is they're developing these applications on a Visual Studio, and the code goes into a Git repository. As soon as the code goes into repository, a build process, which we call Azure build pipeline, the CI part of that build will run some job and will generate a artifact, and that artifact will be stored in Azure artifact. Then once the build is done, it will trigger a deployment or CD part, and that build will pull the artifact from Azure artifact and will deploy into the dev. So from the dev stage, it will deploy on the dev server. Once it's tested and approved, then it will deploy to the QA environment through the QA stage. Once the approval are done and it's successful, it then gets deployed onto the production. Now production, it's deployed on a something called as a blue-green deployment model. Now I'm not going to cover this here, but you have two identical slots where you have one slot is acting as a live production, and second is the one which you need to update and which will run new code. So this CI/CD tool will automatically deploy into the new production environment, which is the new version. Once it's tested, the blue-green deployment model will automatically swap, or you tell and you can swap the URLs. URL will still remain same. It will swap from here to this environment here, or the new version of the copy. So that is a blue-green deployment that we call. So this is done using Azure DevOps. This is the whole DevOps cycle in a multi-environment models. Again, if you're not from Azure DevOps background, which is totally fine. If you are attending Azure DevOps, this is what you'll be doing. One part of that, or 50 to 60% task is this, and then there'll be ops part or management part. If you're not part of Azure 400, which is Azure DevOps, this knowledge will still help in interviews. Then you have a DevOps for QA or testers. So like we saw earlier, which you have DevOps or dev.azure.com. In the dev portal, you have test plans, and your testing team can look at these, saying how many tests are completed successfully, how many are run, how many are blockers, and so on. So from a single panel or single screen, they can check the status of the test cases. So that's DevOps for QA and testers. So that's all about the DevOps for or Azure DevOps on a very high level view. In the next lesson, we are going to talk